Sometimes the most dangerous threat to a royal dynasty comes from within its own bloodline. When an heir becomes a liability, the institution will do anything to protect itself, even if it means watching that heir disappear from history entirely. The question isn't whether they were capable of such ruthlessness, but whether they had any other choice. Throughout history, monarchies have survived by maintaining one sacred principle. The crown must always appear perfect, untouchable, and above the chaos of ordinary human weakness. But what happens when the heir to the throne embodies everything the institution fears? In the glittering world of Victorian Britain, where moral authority was the foundation of imperial power, one young prince threatened to bring the entire system crashing down. His name was Prince Albert Victor, second in line to the British throne, grandson of Queen Victoria herself. To the public, he was a dashing military officer and future king. To those who knew him, he was something far more dangerous, a walking scandal that the monarchy could neither control nor contain. Albert Victor was everything a Victorian prince should not be. Where the crown demanded dignity, he brought chaos. Where it required moral certainty, he carried whispers of unspeakable behavior. While his grandmother Victoria built an empire on the promise of British respectability, Albert Victor moved through London's darkest corners, leaving behind rumors that would have destroyed any ordinary man. But he was not ordinary. He was the heir, protected by layers of palace machinery designed to keep royal secrets buried. Yet even the most powerful institution in the world had limits to what it could cover up. Please subscribe to the channel. It helps me keep making documentaries like this. Born in 1864 as the eldest son of the Prince of Wales, Albert Victor should have been groomed for greatness from his first breath. Instead, he became the monarchy's most closely guarded secret. His tutors whispered about his slow mind and wandering attention. His military commanders complained about his lack of discipline and strange associations. Palace officials watched in growing horror as he moved through aristocratic society, charming on the surface, but leaving devastation in his wake. By his 20s, Albert Victor had become what every monarchy fears most, an heir who could not be trusted with the crown, but could not be removed from the line of succession. The palace tried everything. They sent him abroad, hoping distance would cure his problems. They surrounded him with handlers, trying to control his every move. They arranged strategic friendships and carefully managed public appearances. Nothing worked. The prince who was meant to inherit the greatest empire in history was becoming its greatest threat. And as the scandals grew darker and the whispers louder, those in power began to realize that traditional solutions would not be enough. Something more decisive would be required, something that would ensure Albert Victor never lived to wear the crown. The irony was perfect and terrible. The monarchy that prided itself on tradition and continuity was about to face a crisis that would test whether it valued those principles more than its own survival. Because by 1892, Prince Albert Victor had become a problem that only death could solve. Prince Albert Victor Christian Edward was born on January 8, 1864, in the shadow of Windsor Castle, with the weight of imperial destiny already pressing down on his tiny shoulders. As the firstborn son of the Prince of Wales, he entered the world as the future king of the greatest empire in human history. Yet within months, those closest to the royal nursery began to notice troubling signs. The prince, who should have been Victoria's golden heir, was developing in ways that filled his family with quiet dread. From his earliest years, Albert Victor, known as Eddie to his family, displayed a peculiar combination of charm and vacancy that unsettled his tutors. While his younger brother George absorbed lessons with military precision, Eddie drifted through his education like a beautiful ghost. His attention wandered during the simplest instruction. Complex ideas seemed to slide past him entirely. Palace officials began using careful euphemisms in their reports. The prince was dreamy, artistic, sensitive. Mo. What they meant was that the future king appeared to lack the mental sharpness that monarchy demanded. The brothers were educated together under the strict supervision of John Neil Dalton, a clergyman chosen specifically to mold them into proper princes. Dalton's private reports to the Prince of Wales painted an increasingly disturbing picture. Where George showed promise as a future naval officer, Eddie seemed incapable of focusing on anything beyond immediate pleasure. He was easily distracted, struggled with basic concepts, and showed an alarming tendency toward what Dalton delicately called peculiar friendships with servants and other boys. By 1877, when Eddie was 13, the palace had reached a desperate conclusion. Traditional royal education was failing spectacularly. The solution was radical. Both princes would be sent to sea aboard HMS Britannia, then later HMS Bacante, for 3 years of naval training. The hope was that military discipline would transform Eddie into something resembling a future king. Instead, the voyage would expose his problems to a wider circle of officers and create the first serious scandals surrounding his behavior. During the Caribbean cruise of 1879-1882, whispers began reaching London about the elder prince's conduct. Officers reported that Eddie spent his shore leave in questionable establishments, seeking out experiences that no respectable prince should pursue. There were incidents in port cities that required careful management. The young man who should have been learning seamanship and leadership was instead discovering appetites that terrified his handlers. When the brothers returned to England in 1882, the contrast between them was stark and humiliating. George had emerged as a capable officer with a clear sense of duty. Eddie had become something else entirely, a charming, handsome prince whose very presence made palace officials nervous. He was 18 years old, heir to the throne, and already showing signs of the dangerous instincts that would define his brief life. The naval experiment had failed catastrophically, but it was too late to change course. The monarchy was now committed to managing a future king who seemed fundamentally unsuited for the role, and the next phase of his education would prove even more disastrous. After the naval disaster, the palace tried a different approach. If the sea couldn't discipline Prince Albert Victor, perhaps the army would succeed where the navy had failed. In 1883, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the 10th Royal Hussars, one of Britain's most prestigious cavalry regiments. The posting was meant to instill military virtue and masculine authority in the wayward prince. Instead, it became the stage for his transformation from problematic heir into genuine threat to the crown. The 10th Hussars were stationed at Aldershot, close enough to London that Eddie could maintain his social connections, but far enough away to provide some protection from scandal. His fellow officers initially welcomed the prince with the mixture of deference and curiosity that royal blood commanded. They expected a charming, if somewhat dim aristocrat who would muddle through his duties without causing serious problems. What they discovered was something far more dangerous. A prince whose appetites and associations threatened to drag the regiment into the kind of scandal that could destroy careers. Eddie's problems began almost immediately. His attendance at drills was sporadic. His attention during training exercises wandered to the point of embarrassment. While other officers socialized at the regimental club or pursued appropriate romantic interests, Eddie disappeared into London's shadows, returning with stories that horrified his commanding officers. He spent his leave in music halls and private clubs where respectable gentlemen never ventured. Worse still, he began forming friendships with men whose backgrounds and intentions raised serious questions about his judgment. The first major incident came in 1885, when Eddie's association with a group of London aesthetes nearly exploded into public scandal. These were men who moved in artistic circles, wrote poetry, and lived lives that conventional society viewed with deep suspicion. When one of them was arrested on charges that could have implicated the prince, palace fixers moved swiftly to contain the damage. Money changed hands, witnesses became forgetful, The story disappeared from the newspapers before it could fully form. But the pattern was now clear. Eddie attracted trouble like a magnet, and each incident required more desperate measures to suppress. His regimental commander, Colonel Valentine Baker, tried everything to reform his royal subordinate. He assigned trusted officers to shadow Eddie during his London visits. He arranged suitable social events to keep the prince occupied with appropriate company. He even had quiet conversations with Eddie about the responsibilities that came with his position. Nothing worked. The prince seemed incapable of understanding that his behavior reflected on the entire institution of monarchy, or perhaps he simply didn't care. By 1887, Baker was writing increasingly frantic reports to the War Office about his inability to control the prince's conduct. Other officers were beginning to request transfers, rather than serve alongside someone whose presence guaranteed unwelcome attention from palace officials and potential association with unspeakable scandals. The 10th Hussars, once proud of their royal connection, now viewed Prince Albert Victor as a liability that threatened their reputation and careers. The writing was on the wall. Military service had failed as spectacularly as naval training. But the monarchy couldn't simply abandon the heir to his own devices. Something more dramatic would be required to contain the growing crisis. And in the shadows of London, a scandal was already forming that would test the palace's ability to protect its most dangerous secret. In July 1889, a routine investigation into stolen money at the Central Post Office uncovered something far more explosive than petty theft. Telegraph boys were living well beyond their modest salaries, spending money they couldn't possibly have earned legitimately. Under questioning, they revealed the source of their unexpected wealth: a house at 19 Cleveland Street in London's Fitzrovia district, where gentlemen paid handsomely for services that Victorian society refused to acknowledge existed. What began as a minor financial inquiry was about to become the scandal that nearly brought down the monarchy. The Cleveland Street house operated as a male brothel, catering to aristocrats and prominent figures who sought encounters that were not only socially unacceptable, but criminally punishable. As police investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a client list that read like a directory of London's elite. Names emerged that sent shockwaves through the highest levels of government and society. Among them was Lord Arthur Somerset, a close friend of the Prince of Wales and equerry to the royal household. But far more dangerous was another whisper that began circulating through London's drawing rooms and gentlemen's clubs. The suggestion that Prince Albert Victor himself had been a frequent visitor to Cleveland Street. The evidence linking Eddie to the scandal was thin and largely based on rumor. But in the fevered atmosphere of Victorian moral panic, rumor was enough to destroy reputations. Palace officials moved with unprecedented speed to contain the damage. Lord Somerset was quietly advised to leave the country, which he did with suspicious haste, fleeing to exile in France. Other prominent figures simply disappeared from London society until the storm passed. But Prince Albert Victor couldn't flee. He was the heir to the throne, and his very existence had become a liability that threatened the crown itself. The press coverage of Cleveland Street was carefully managed, but whispers proved impossible to control. In private salons and political circles, people spoke in coded language about certain personages and unnatural practices that supposedly reached into the royal family itself. Foreign newspapers, free from British libel laws, began printing stories that came dangerously close to naming the prince directly. French and German publications reveled in the possibility that Britain's future king was implicated in criminal behavior that violated every principle of Victorian morality. Behind palace walls, panic reigned. Queen Victoria was reportedly furious that her grandson's reputation was being destroyed by association with the lowest depths of human depravity. The Prince of Wales found himself in the impossible position of defending a son whose behavior he couldn't understand or control. Government officials worried that the monarchy itself might not survive if the public came to believe that their future king was capable of such conduct. The Cleveland Street investigation was ultimately suppressed through a combination of legal maneuvering, press manipulation, and strategic payments. But the damage to Prince Albert Victor was irreversible. His name had been spoken in the same breath as criminal behavior and moral corruption. Even if the charges were unfounded, the stain on his reputation was permanent. The palace now faced a terrifying reality. Their heir had become so toxic that his very existence threatened the institution of monarchy. Something decisive would have to be done, and soon, before the next scandal finished what Cleveland Street had started. The Cleveland Street scandal had exposed the monarchy's greatest weakness. Prince Albert Victor was now too dangerous to ignore and too important to abandon. In the months following the investigation, palace officials implemented damage control measures that revealed just how far the institution would go to protect itself. What emerged was a sophisticated machinery of reputation management, press manipulation, and strategic misdirection that would define royal crisis management for generations to come. The first priority was distance. Prince Albert Victor was immediately removed from London society and sent on an extended tour of British India, ostensibly to broaden his imperial education, but actually to put an ocean between him and potential scandals. The tour, lasting from October 1889 to May 1890, was carefully choreographed to present the prince as a dutiful imperial heir learning the responsibilities of future kingship. Official photographs showed him meeting maharajas, inspecting troops, and participating in elaborate ceremonial events that reinforced his image as a proper royal representative. Behind the scenes, a different operation was underway. Palace fixers worked systematically to eliminate any evidence linking the prince to Cleveland Street or similar establishments. Witnesses found themselves offered generous payments to forget what they had seen. Journalists discovered that certain stories would never see print, regardless of their truth. Police files mysteriously disappeared or were classified beyond public access. The machinery of the British state was mobilized to erase Albert Victor's problematic past and create a sanitized version of his character suitable for public consumption. Please subscribe to the channel if you want more real royal stories like this. But the palace faced a fundamental problem that no amount of manipulation could solve. The scandals weren't just about past behavior, they were about Albert Victor's basic character. Every attempt to reform him had failed. Military service hadn't provided discipline. Foreign travel hadn't broadened his perspective. Social supervision hadn't controlled his associations. The prince seemed incapable of change, which meant that future scandals were inevitable. Palace officials began to realize that traditional damage control would never be enough to contain a problem of this magnitude. During his Indian tour, disturbing reports continued to reach London. Even under careful supervision, Prince Albert Victor found ways to embarrass his handlers. There were incidents at regimental dinners where his behavior raised eyebrows. There were questions about his associations with young men on his staff. There were moments of confused thinking that suggested problems beyond mere moral weakness. The tour that was meant to rehabilitate his image instead provided fresh evidence that the heir was fundamentally unsuited for the throne. By 1890, a grim consensus was forming among those closest to the crown. Albert Victor was not going to improve. Traditional solutions had been exhausted. The scandals would continue, and each one would be harder to suppress than the last. The monarchy was now trapped in an impossible situation. They couldn't control their heir, but they couldn't afford to let him inherit the throne. As the prince returned to England, palace officials were already contemplating solutions that went far beyond conventional damage control. Because soon, the problem of Albert Victor would intersect with the greatest criminal mystery of the age, creating a perfect storm that threatened to destroy everything the monarchy had worked to protect. While Prince Albert Victor was struggling with the Cleveland Street scandal, London was gripped by terror of a different kind. In the autumn of 1888, a series of brutal murders in Whitechapel had captured the world's attention and created the most infamous criminal in British history, Jack the Ripper. The killer's victims were prostitutes, butchered with surgical precision in the dark alleys of London's East End. The murders shocked Victorian society, not just for their brutality, but for their apparent randomness and the killer's ability to evade capture despite massive police efforts. What should have been an unrelated criminal investigation became another nightmare for the royal family when whispers began connecting Prince Albert Victor to the Ripper case. The theories varied in their details, but they shared a common thread: the suggestion that the heir to the throne was somehow involved in the most notorious crimes of the age. Some claimed he was the killer himself, driven to murder by syphilis-induced madness. Others suggested he was being protected by a royal cover-up after accidentally becoming involved with one of the victims. The most elaborate theory proposed that the murders were part of a Masonic conspiracy to silence witnesses who knew embarrassing secrets about the prince. These theories were based on speculation rather than evidence, but in the fevered atmosphere of late Victorian London, speculation was enough to do tremendous damage. The timing was particularly unfortunate for the monarchy. The Ripper murders occurred just as Albert Victor's reputation was being systematically destroyed by his own behavior and the Cleveland Street scandal. Public fascination with the unsolved crimes created an environment where any rumor, no matter how outlandish, could find an eager audience. The connection between the prince and the murders was promoted most enthusiastically by those who already had reasons to suspect the royal family of moral corruption. Republican newspapers and foreign publications seized on the theories as evidence of aristocratic decadence and criminal behavior at the highest levels of British society.
French journals in particular delighted in suggesting that Britain's future king was not just morally corrupt, but potentially a homicidal maniac. The stories spread through London society with the speed of wildfire, creating a toxic cloud of suspicion around the prince. Palace officials found themselves fighting a war on multiple fronts.
While they struggled to contain the Cleveland Street scandal and manage Albert Victor's continuing behavioral problems, they now had to address the even more serious allegation that he might be connected to murder. The Ripper theories were impossible to disprove definitively because the killer was never caught, which meant the suspicion would linger indefinitely. Every unsolved aspect of the case became potential fuel for new conspiracy theories involving the prince. The situation was made worse by Albert Victor's own reaction to the rumors. Rather than maintaining dignified silence, he seemed to find the notoriety amusing, sometimes making joking references to the stories in private conversation. His apparent inability to grasp the seriousness of being connected to mass murder further convinced palace officials that he was fundamentally unsuited for public life. Here was an heir who treated accusations of involvement in serial killing as entertainment rather than existential threat. By 1890, the combination of Cleveland Street, the Ripper theories, and Albert Victor's ongoing scandals had created an impossible situation for the monarchy. The prince had become synonymous with criminal behavior in the public mind, and no amount of damage control seemed capable of rehabilitating his reputation. Palace officials realized they were running out of conventional options for managing their most dangerous secret. By 1891, the palace had exhausted conventional solutions to the Prince Albert Victor problem. Military service had failed. Foreign travel had provided only temporary relief. Damage control was becoming increasingly expensive and less effective with each new scandal. Palace officials needed something dramatic enough to fundamentally transform public perception of the heir, something that would suggest stability, maturity, and moral reformation. Their solution was as old as monarchy itself: marriage. But this would not be a romantic union. It would be a carefully orchestrated performance designed to save the crown from its most dangerous liability. The chosen bride was Princess Victoria Mary of Teck, known as May to her family. She was perfect for the palace's purposes. Young, beautiful, well-connected, and possessed of an impeccable reputation that could theoretically balance Albert Victor's toxic public image. More importantly, she was personally desperate for an advantageous marriage. Her family had limited financial resources and questionable royal status. Her father was the product of a morganatic marriage that left him technically royal, but practically impoverished. May needed this marriage as much as the palace needed her respectability. The engagement was announced in December 1891, with fanfare calculated to overwhelm any lingering whispers about the prince's past. Newspapers that had been carefully managed to avoid mentioning Cleveland Street or Ripper theories were suddenly full of romantic stories about the royal couple. Official photographs showed Albert Victor looking dignified and responsible beside his elegant fiancée. Palace spin doctors worked overtime to present the engagement as evidence that the prince had matured beyond his youthful indiscretions and was ready to embrace his royal destiny. Behind the scenes, the arrangement was far more calculating than the public understood. May was essentially being asked to save the monarchy by transforming an unsuitable heir into an acceptable king through the civilizing power of marriage. The palace believed that domestic responsibility would provide the structure and motivation that military discipline had failed to instill. A wife would give Albert Victor someone to answer to. Children would give him a reason to behave responsibly. The institution of marriage itself would force him to conform to social expectations or risk destroying not just his own reputation, but that of his family. The strategy showed signs of working, at least superficially. Albert Victor's public appearances with his fiancée were notably more successful than his previous solo performances. He seemed calmer, more focused, possibly even happy in a way that those who knew him had rarely observed. May's influence appeared to be genuine. She was intelligent enough to understand the stakes and strong-willed enough to impose some discipline on her chaotic future husband. For the first time in years, palace officials allowed themselves to hope that their most intractable problem might actually be solved. But the engagement also revealed the monarchy's desperation. They were gambling the institution's future on the unproven theory that marriage could fundamentally change a man's character. If Albert Victor remained uncontrollable after marriage, the scandal would be even worse because it would involve his innocent wife and any children they might have. The palace was essentially betting everything on a single roll of the dice, and soon that gamble would become irrelevant in the most unexpected way possible. The winter of 1891-1892 should have been the most hopeful period in Prince Albert Victor's life. His engagement to Princess May had been celebrated across the empire. Wedding preparations were underway for a ceremony planned for February 27, 1892. For the first time since childhood, the prince seemed to have found a path that might lead to respectability and eventual redemption. Palace officials were cautiously optimistic that their gamble on marriage might actually succeed in transforming their most problematic heir into an acceptable king. But fate, or perhaps something more calculated, was about to intervene in the most permanent way possible. The first signs of illness appeared in early January 1892 during the traditional royal Christmas celebrations at Sandringham. Albert Victor complained of feeling unwell after returning from a shooting party on the Norfolk estate. Initially, his symptoms seemed minor: fatigue, headaches, a general sense of malaise that could have been attributed to the stress of wedding preparations or the unusually harsh winter weather. Royal physicians diagnosed influenza, a common ailment that typically resolved itself with rest and proper care. No one expected the illness to become serious, let alone life-threatening. But the prince's condition deteriorated with alarming speed. Within days, his fever spiked dramatically, and he began experiencing severe respiratory distress. The influenza had apparently developed into pneumonia, a complication that could be dangerous but was rarely fatal in young, otherwise healthy individuals. Palace doctors brought in specialists from London, but despite their efforts, Albert Victor continued to decline. By mid-January, It was clear that the heir to the throne was fighting for his life. The timing of the illness was remarkable in its convenience for the monarchy. Just when the palace had finally found a potential solution to their Albert Victor problem, nature appeared to be offering a more permanent resolution. Those closest to the situation couldn't help but notice how perfectly the crisis served the institution's interests. A dead heir would eliminate the scandals, the constant anxiety about future behavior, and the risk that marriage might not actually reform the prince's character. Death would transform Albert Victor from liability into tragic martyr, allowing the monarchy to mourn him publicly while privately breathing a sigh of relief. As news of the prince's illness spread, public sympathy began building in ways that would have been impossible during the scandals of previous years. The British press, which had been carefully managed to suppress stories about Cleveland Street and other embarrassments, now covered the prince's struggle with touching concern. Foreign newspapers that had delighted in spreading rumors about his connection to Jack the Ripper suddenly portrayed him as a noble young man struck down in his prime. The very publications that had once threatened to destroy his reputation were now contributing to its rehabilitation through tragedy. The irony was profound and disturbing. Albert Victor was becoming more valuable to the monarchy dead than he had ever been alive. His illness was solving problems that years of damage control had failed to address. And as his condition worsened through January, palace officials began to realize that they were about to receive the greatest gift the institution had ever been given: the permanent elimination of their most dangerous secret. On January 14th, 1892, at 9:35 in the morning, Prince Albert Victor died at Sandringham House. He was 28 years old, 6 weeks away from his wedding, and second in line to the throne of the British Empire. The official cause of death was pneumonia following influenza, a medical explanation that was entirely plausible and completely unverifiable given the primitive autopsy procedures of the time. Within hours of his death, the monarchy's greatest crisis had been transformed into its most convenient tragedy. The transformation of Albert Victor's reputation was immediate and total. Newspapers that had spent years carefully avoiding mention of his scandals now competed to publish the most glowing tributes to the fallen prince. He was described as devoted to duty, beloved by his men, and deeply committed to his future bride. Stories emerged about his charitable works, his kindness to servants, and his dedication to the empire. The same publications that had once whispered about Cleveland Street and Jack the Ripper now portrayed him as a model of royal virtue struck down in his prime. Princess May played her role perfectly in this posthumous rehabilitation. Her grief appeared genuine and profound, which helped sell the narrative that Albert Victor had been a loving fiancé rather than a reluctant participant in an arranged marriage. Her dignified mourning transformed what could have been an embarrassing broken engagement into a romantic tragedy that captured public sympathy. The woman who had been chosen to save the prince through marriage now saved his reputation through widowhood. The palace orchestrated Albert Victor's funeral with the same precision they had once used to suppress his scandals. The ceremony at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, was designed to project dignity, continuity, and imperial strength. Royal representatives from across Europe attended, demonstrating that the British monarchy remained respected despite the recent crisis. The elaborate ritual of royal mourning allowed the institution to process its relief as grief, transforming private celebration into public sorrow. But the most remarkable aspect of Albert Victor's death was how completely it solved every problem the monarchy had faced. The Cleveland Street connections were immediately forgotten as the press focused on tribute rather than investigation. The Jack the Ripper theories became unmentionable in the face of public mourning. His behavioral problems were rewritten as youthful high spirits. His intellectual limitations became touching vulnerability. Death had accomplished what years of damage control, foreign travel, military service, and strategic engagement had failed to achieve. It had made Albert Victor safe for the monarchy. The succession now fell to his younger brother George, the naval officer who had always been everything Albert Victor was not: disciplined, dutiful, conventional, and utterly reliable. Palace officials could barely contain their relief at this development. They had traded an unsuitable heir for a perfect one, a liability for an asset, a crisis for an opportunity. The institution that had spent years terrified of Albert Victor's potential kingship could now look forward to George's reign with genuine confidence. As the mourning period concluded and royal life returned to normal, one fact became undeniably clear. Prince Albert Victor's death was the most fortunate event in the modern history of the British monarchy. Nature, or perhaps something more deliberate, had intervened to save the crown from its most dangerous secret. In the aftermath of Prince Albert Victor's convenient death, the British monarchy executed one of the most successful cover-ups in royal history. Not only did they erase the scandals that had nearly destroyed the institution, they also managed to rewrite the entire narrative of succession to present George V's accession as natural and inevitable, rather than the desperate salvation it actually represented. What emerged was a masterclass in institutional self-preservation that would define royal crisis management for the next century. George V, the former spare who suddenly became heir, was everything the monarchy needed. Where Albert Victor had been unpredictable, George was steady. Where the dead prince had courted scandal, George embodied respectability. Where Albert Victor had seemed incapable of understanding royal duty, George had spent years in naval service learning discipline and command. The institution that had nearly been destroyed by one brother now found itself perfectly served by another. The contrast was so striking that it seemed almost too convenient to be coincidental. The most remarkable aspect of the transition was how completely Albert Victor disappeared from royal memory. Within months of his death, references to his scandals vanished from public discourse. The Cleveland Street affair became unmentionable. The Jack the Ripper theories were buried beneath layers of official silence. His behavioral problems were reimagined as tragic vulnerability rather than dangerous instability. The monarchy had achieved something unprecedented. They had successfully erased their own history and replaced it with a more acceptable version. Princess May's role in this transformation proved crucial. Rather than being discarded as the widow of a failed prince, she was seamlessly transferred to George V, marrying him in 1893 and becoming Queen Mary. This arrangement served multiple purposes. It prevented her from becoming an embarrassing reminder of the Albert Victor scandal. It provided George with a suitable consort, and it demonstrated the monarchy's ability to adapt and survive even the most challenging circumstances. The woman who was meant to save one prince through marriage ended up legitimizing another through the same institution. The official histories written about this period carefully omitted any mention of Albert Victor's real problems. Biographers focused on his tragic early death rather than his scandalous life. Palace archives were carefully curated to exclude embarrassing documents. Witnesses to his behavior were either bought, silenced, or simply ignored until they died and took their secrets with them. By the time George V was crowned in 1911, Albert Victor had been transformed from the monarchy's greatest liability into a romantic footnote, barely worth mentioning. Please subscribe to the channel. The next story is even more unbelievable. The story of Prince Albert Victor reveals the most terrifying truth about monarchy. When an institution's survival is threatened, it is capable of almost anything. Whether his death was natural coincidence or something more calculated may never be known. But what is certain is that the British monarchy emerged from its greatest crisis stronger than ever, having learned that sometimes the most effective solution to an impossible problem is not reform or rehabilitation, but elimination. The heir who was too dangerous to live became, in death, the perfect prince who never was.